How Six Men Traveled Through the Wide World by Andrew Lang. There was once upon a time a man who understood all sorts of arts. He served in the war and bore himself bravely and well. But when the war was over, he got his discharge and set out on his travels with 3 farthings of his pay in his pocket weight. He said, "That does not please me, only let me find the right people, and the king shall yet give me all the treasures of his kingdom." He strode angrily into the forest, and there he saw a man standing who had uprooted 6 trees, as if they were straws. He said to him, "Will you be my servant and travel with me?" "Yes," he answered, "but first of all I will take this little bundle of sticks home to my mother." And he took one of the trees, and wound it round the other 5, raised the bundle on his shoulders, and bore it off. Then he came back and went with his master, who said, "We too ought to be able to travel through the wide world." And when they had gone a little way, they came upon a hunter, who was on his knees, his gun on his shoulder, aiming at something. The master said to him, "Hunter, what are you aiming at?" He answered, 2 miles from this place sits a fly on a branch of an oak. I want to shoot out its left eye." "Oh, go with me," said the man. "If we 3 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." The hunter agreed and went with him, and they came to 7 windmills whose sails were going round quite fast, and yet there was not a breath of wind, nor was a leaf moving. The man said, "I don't know what is turning those windmills. There is not the slightest breeze blowing." So he walked on with his servants, and when they had gone 2 miles, they saw a man sitting on a tree holding one of his nostrils and blowing out of the other. "Fellow, what are you puffing it up there?" asked them. He replied, 2 miles from this place are standing 7 windmills. See, I am blowing to drive them round." "Oh, go with me," said the man. "If we 4 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." So the blower got down and went with him, and after a time they saw a man who was standing on one leg and had unstrapped the other and laid it near him. Then said the master, "You have made yourself very comfortable to rest." "I am a runner," answered he, "and so that I shall not go too quickly, I have unstrapped one leg. When I run with 2 legs, I go faster than a bird flies." "Oh, go with me. If we 5 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." So he went with him, and not long afterwards they met a man who wore a little hat, but he had it slouched over one ear. "Manners, manners," said the master to him, "don't hang your hat over one ear, you look like a madman." "I dare not," said the other, "for if I were to put my hat on straight, there would come such a frost that the very birds in the sky would freeze and fall dead on the earth." "Oh, go with me," said the master. "If we 6 are together, we shall easily travel through the wide world." Now the 6 came to a town in which the king had proclaimed that whoever should run with his daughter in a race and win should become her husband. But if he lost, he must lose his head. This was reported to the man who declared he would compete, but he said, "I shall let my servant run for me." The king replied, "Then both your heads must be staked, and your head and his must be guaranteed for the winner." When this was agreed upon and settled, the man strapped on the runner's other leg, saying to him, "Now be nimble, and see that we win." It was arranged that whoever should first bring water out of a stream a long way off should be the victor. Then the runner got a pitcher, and the king's daughter another, and they began to run at the same time. But in a moment, when the king's daughter was only just a little way off, no spectator could see the runner, and it seemed as if the wind had whistled past. In a short time he reached the stream, filled his pitcher with water, and turned round again. But halfway home a great drowsiness came over him. He put down his pitcher, lay down, and fell asleep. He had, however, put a horse's skull, which was lying on the ground, for his pillow, so that he should not be too comfortable and might soon wake up. In the meantime, the king's daughter, who could also run well as an ordinary man could, reach the stream and hastened back with her pitcher full of water. When she saw the runner lying there asleep, she was delighted, and said, "My enemy is given into my hands." She emptied his pitcher and ran on. Everything now would have been lost if by good luck the hunter had not been standing on the castle tower and had seen everything with his sharp eyes. "Ah," said he, "the king's daughter shall not overreach us." And loading his gun, he shot so cleverly that he shot away the horse's skull from under the runner's head without its hurting him. Then the runner awoke, jumped up, and saw that his pitcher was empty, and the king's daughter far ahead. But he did not lose courage, and ran back to the stream with his pitcher, filled it once more with water, and was home 10 minutes before the king's daughter arrived. "Look," said he, "I have only just exercised my legs. That was nothing of a run." But the king was angry, and his daughter even more so, that she should be carried away by a common discharged soldier. They consulted together how they could destroy both him and his companions. Then said the king to her, I have found a way, don't be frightened, they shall not come home again. He said to them, You must now make merry together and eat and drink. And he led them into a room which had a floor of iron, the doors were also of iron, and the windows were barred with iron. In the room was a table spread with delicious food. The king said to them, Go in, and enjoy yourselves. And as soon as they were inside, he had the doors shut and bolted. Then he made the cook come and ordered him to keep up a large fire under the room, until the iron was red hot. The cook did so. And the six sitting round the table felt it grow very warm, and they thought this was because of their good fare. But when the heat became still greater, and they wanted to go out, but found the doors and windows fastened, then they knew that the king meant them harm, and was trying to suffocate them. But he shall not succeed, cried he of the little hat. I will make a frost come, which shall make the fire ashamed and die out. So he put his hat on straight, and at once there came such a frost that all the heat disappeared, and the food on the dishes began to freeze when a couple of hours had passed, and the king thought they must be quite dead from the heat. He had the doors opened, and went in himself to see. But when the doors were opened, there stood all six alive, and well, saying they were glad they could come out to warm themselves, for the great cold in the room had frozen all the food hard in the dishes. Then the king went angrily to the cook and scolded him, and asked him why he had not done what he was told. But the cook answered, There is heat enough there, see for yourself. Then the king saw a huge fire burning under the iron room, and understood that he could do no harm to the six in this way. The king now began again to think how he could free himself from his unwelcome guests. He commanded the master to come before him, and said, If you will take gold and give up your right to my daughter, you shall have as much as you like. Oh yes, your majesty, answered he, give me as much as my servant can carry, and I will give up your daughter. The king was delighted, and the man said, I will come and fetch it in 14 days. Then he called all the tailors in the kingdom together, and made them sit down for 14 days sewing at a sack. When it was finished, he made the strong man who had uprooted the trees take the sack on his shoulder, and go with him to the king. Then the king said, What a powerful fellow that is carrying that bale of linen as large as a house on his shoulder. And he was much frightened, and thought, What a lot of gold he will make away with. Then he had a ton of gold brought, which 16 of the strongest men had to carry. But the strong man seized it with one hand, put it in the sack, saying, Why don't you bring me more? That scarcely covers the bottom. Then the king had to send again, and again to fetch his treasures, which the strong man shoved into the sack, and the sack was only half full. Bring more, he cried, these crumbs don't fill it. So 7,000 wagons of the gold of the whole kingdom were driven up, these the strong man shoved into the sack, oxen and all. I will no longer be particular, he said, and will take what comes, so that the sack shall be full. When everything was put in, and there was not yet enough, he said, I will make an end of this. It is easy to fasten a sack when it is not full. Then he threw it on his back and went with his companions. Now when the king saw how a single man was carrying away the wealth of the whole country, he was very angry, and made his cavalry mount and pursue the six, and bring back the strong man with the sack. 2 regiments soon overtook them, and called to them, You are prisoners, lay down the sack of gold, or you shall be cut down. What do you say, said the blower, we are prisoners, before that you shall dance in the air. And he held one nostril and blew with the other at the 2 regiments. They were separated and blown away in the blue sky over the mountains, one this way, and the other that. A sergeant major cried for mercy, saying he had 9 wounds and was a brave fellow, and did not deserve this disgrace. So the blower let him off, and he came down without hurt. Then he said to him, Now go home to the king, and say that if he sends any more cavalry, I will blow them all into the air. When the king received the message, he said, Let the fellows go, they are bewitched. Then the 6 brought the treasure home, shared it among themselves, and lived contentedly till the end of their days. The Wizard King 14. In very ancient times, there lived a king whose power lay not only in the vast extent of his dominions, but also in the magic secrets of which he was master. After spending the greater part of his early youth in pleasure, he met a princess of such remarkable beauty that he at once asked her hand in marriage, and having obtained it, considered himself the happiest of men. After a year's time, a son was born, worthy in every way of such distinguished parents, and much admired by the whole court. As soon as the queen thought him strong enough for a journey, she set out with him secretly to visit her fairy godmother. I said secretly, because the fairy had warned the queen that the king was a magician, and as from time immemorial there had been a standing feud between the fairies and the wizards, he might not have approved of his wife's visit. The fairy godmother, who took the deepest interest in all the queen's concerns, and who was much pleased with the little prince, endowed him with the power of pleasing everybody from his cradle, as well as with a wonderful ease in learning everything, which could help to make him a perfectly accomplished prince. Accordingly to the delight of his teachers, he made the most rapid progress in his education, constantly surpassing everyone's expectations. Before he was many years old, however, he had the great sorrow of losing his mother, whose last words were to advise him never to undertake anything of importance without consulting the fairy under whose protection she had placed him. The prince's grief at the death of his mother was great, but it was nothing compared to that of the king his father, who was quite inconsolable for the loss of his dear wife. Neither time nor reason seemed to lighten his sorrow, and the sight of all the familiar faces and things about him only served to remind him of his loss. He therefore resolved to travel for change, and by means of his magic art was able to visit every country he came to see under different shapes, returning every few weeks to the place where he had left a few followers. Having traveled from land to land in this fashion, without finding anything to rivet his attention, it occurred to him to take the form of an eagle, and in this shape he flew across many countries, and arrived at length in a new and lovely spot, where the air seemed filled with the scent of jessamine and orange flowers, with which the ground was thickly planted. Attracted by the sweet perfume, he flew lower, and perceived some large and beautiful gardens filled with the rarest flowers, and with fountains throwing up their clear waters into the air in 100 different shapes. A wide stream flowed through the garden, and on it floated richly ornamented barges and gondolas, filled with people dressed in the most elegant manner, and covered with jewels. In one of these barges sat the queen of that country with her only daughter, a maiden more beautiful than the day star, and attended by the ladies of the court. No more exquisitely lovely mortal was ever seen than this princess, and it needed all an eagle's strength of sight to prevent the king being hopelessly dazzled. He perched on the top of a large orange tree, whence he was able to survey the scene, and to gaze at pleasure on the princess' charms. Now an eagle with a king's heart in his breast is apt to be bold, and accordingly, he instantly made up his mind to carry off the lovely damsel, feeling sure that having once seen her, he could not live without her. He waited till he saw her in the act of stepping ashore, when suddenly swooping down, he carried her off before her equerry in attendance had advanced to offer her his hand. The princess, on finding herself in an eagle's talons, uttered the most heartbreaking shrieks and cries, but her captor, though touched by her distress, would not abandon his lovely prey, and continued to fly through the air too fast to allow of his saying anything to comfort her. At length, when he thought they had reached a safe distance, he began to lower his flight, and gradually descending to earth, deposited his burden in a flowery meadow. He then entreated her pardon for his violence, and told her that he was about to carry her to a great kingdom over which he ruled, and where he desired she should rule with him, adding many tender and consoling expressions. For some time the princess remained speechless, but recovering herself a little, she burst into a flood of tears. The king, much moved, said, "Adorable princess, dry your tears. I implore you, my only wish is to make you the happiest person in the world." "If you speak truth, my lord," replied the princess, "restore to me the liberty you have deprived me of. Otherwise, I can only look on you as my worst enemy." The king retorted that her opposition filled him with despair, but that he hoped to carry her to a place where all around would respect her, and where every pleasure would surround her. So saying, he seized her once more, and in spite of all her cries, he rapidly bore her off to the neighborhood of his capital. Here he gently placed her on a lawn, and as he did so, she saw a magnificent palace spring up at her feet. The architecture was imposing, and in the interior the rooms were handsome and furnished in the best possible taste. The princess, who expected to be quite alone, was pleased at finding herself surrounded by a number of pretty girls, all anxious to wait on her, whilst a brilliantly colored parrot said the most agreeable things in the world. On arriving at this palace, the king had resumed his own form, and though no longer young, he might well have pleased any other than this princess, who had been so prejudiced against him by his violence that she could only regard him with feelings of hatred which she was at no pains to conceal. The king hoped, however, that time might not only soften her anger, but accustom her to his sight. He took the precaution of surrounding the palace with a dense cloud, and then hastened to his court, where his prolonged absence was causing much anxiety. The prince and all the courtiers were delighted to see their beloved king again, but they had to submit themselves to more frequent absences than ever on his part. He made business a pretext for shutting himself up in his study, but it was really in order to spend the time with the princess, who remained inflexible. Not being able to imagine what could be the cause of so much obstinacy, the king began to fear, lest in spite of all his precautions, she might have heard of the charms of the prince his son, whose goodness, youth, and beauty made him adored at court. This idea made him horribly uneasy, and he resolved to remove the cause of his fears by sending the prince on his travels escorted by a magnificent retinue. The prince, after visiting several courts, arrived at the one where the lost princess was still deeply mourned. The king and queen received him most graciously, and some festivities were revived to do him honor. One day when the prince was visiting the queen in her own apartments, he was much struck by a most beautiful portrait. He eagerly inquired whose it was, and the queen with many tears told him it was all that was left her of her beloved daughter, who had suddenly been carried off, she knew neither where nor how. The prince was deeply moved and vowed that he would search the world for the princess, and take no rest till he had found and restored her to her mother's arms. The queen assured him of her eternal gratitude, and promised, should he succeed, to give him her daughter in marriage together with all the estates she herself owned. The prince, far more attracted by the thoughts of possessing the princess than her promised dower, set forth in his quest, after taking leave of the king and queen, the latter giving him a miniature of her daughter, which she was in the habit of wearing. His first act was to seek the fairy under whose protection he had been placed, and he implored her to give him all the assistance of her art and counsel in this important matter. After listening attentively to the whole adventure, the fairy asked for time to consult her books. After due consideration, she informed the prince that the object of his search was not far distant, but that it was too difficult for him to attempt to enter the enchanted palace where she was, as the king his father had surrounded it with a thick cloud, and that the only expedient she could think of would be to gain possession of the princess parrot. This, she added, did not appear impossible, as it often flew about to some distance in the neighborhood. Having told the prince all this, the fairy went out in hopes of seeing the parrot, and soon returned with the bird in her hand. She promptly shut it up in a cage, and touching the prince with her wand, transformed him into an exactly similar parrot, after which she instructed him how to reach the princess. The prince reached the palace in safety, but was so dazzled at first by the princess' beauty, which far surpassed his expectations, that he was quite dumb for a time. The princess was surprised and anxious, and fearing the parrot, who was her greatest comfort, had fallen ill, she took him in her hand and caressed him. This soon reassured the prince and encouraged him to play his part well, and he began to say 1,000 agreeable things which charmed the princess. Presently the king appeared, and the parrot noticed with joy how much he was disliked. As soon as the king left the princess, retired to her dressing room, the parrot flew after her, and overheard her lamentations at the continued persecutions of the king, who had pressed her to consent to their marriage. The parrot said so many clever and tender things to comfort her that she began to doubt whether this could indeed be her own parrot. When he saw her well disposed towards him, he exclaimed, "Madam, I have a most important secret to confide to you, and I beg you not to be alarmed by what I am about to say. I am here on behalf of the queen your mother, with the object of delivering your highness to prove which behold this portrait which she gave me herself." So saying, he drew forth the miniature from under his wing. The princess' surprise was great, but after what she had seen and heard, it was impossible not to indulge in hope, for she had recognized the likeness of herself which her mother always wore. The parrot, finding she was not much alarmed, told her who he was, all that her mother had promised him, and the help he had already received from a fairy, who had assured him that she would give him means to transport the princess to her mother's arms. When he found her listening attentively to him, he implored the princess to allow him to resume his natural shape. She did not speak, so he drew a feather from his wing, and she beheld before her a prince of such surpassing beauty that it was impossible not to hope that she might owe her liberty to so charming a person. Meantime the fairy had prepared a chariot to which she harnessed 2 powerful eagles, then placing the cage with the parrot in it, she charged the bird to conduct it to the window of the princess' dressing room. This was done in a few minutes, and the princess, stepping into the chariot with the prince, was delighted to find her parrot again. As they rose through the air, the princess remarked a figure mounted on an eagle's back flying in front of the chariot. She was rather alarmed, but the prince reassured her, telling her it was the good fairy to whom she owed so much, and who was now conducting her in safety to her mother. That same morning, the king woke suddenly from a troubled sleep. He had dreamt that the princess was being carried off from him, and transforming himself into an eagle, he flew to the palace. When he failed to find her, he flew into a terrible rage, and hastened home to consult his books, by which means he discovered that it was his son who had deprived him of this precious treasure. Immediately he took the shape of a harpy, and filled with rage was determined to devour his son, and even the princess too, if only he could overtake them. He set out at full speed, but he started too late and was further delayed by a strong wind, which the fairy raised behind the young couple so as to baffle any pursuit. You may imagine the rapture with which the queen received the daughter she had given up for lost, as well as the amiable prince, who had rescued her. The fairy entered with them, and warned the queen that the wizard king would shortly arrive, infuriated by his loss, and that nothing could preserve the prince and princess from his rage and magic, unless they were actually married. The queen hastened to inform the king, her husband, and the wedding took place on the spot. As the ceremony was completed, the wizard king arrived. His despair at being so late bewildered him so entirely that he appeared in his natural form, and attempted to sprinkle some black liquid over the bride and bridegroom, which was intended to kill them. But the fairy stretched out her wand, and the liquid dropped on the magician himself. He fell down senseless, and the princess' father, deeply offended at the cruel revenge which had been attempted, ordered him to be removed and locked up in prison. Now, as magicians lose all their power as soon as they are in prison, the king felt himself much embarrassed at being thus at the mercy of those he had so greatly offended. The prince implored and obtained his father's pardon, and the prison doors were opened. No sooner was this done than the wizard king was seen in the air under the form of some unknown bird, exclaiming, as he flew off, that he would never forgive either his son or the fairy the cruel wrong they had done him. Everyone entreated the fairy to settle in the kingdom where she now was, to which she consented. She built herself a magnificent palace, to which she transported her books and fairy secrets, and where she enjoyed the sight of the perfect happiness she had helped to bestow on the entire royal family. The Nixie 15. There was once upon a time a miller who was very well off and had as much money, and as many goods, as he knew what to do with. But sorrow comes in the night, and the miller all of a sudden became so poor that at last he could hardly call the mill in which he sat his own. He wandered about all day full of despair and misery, and when he lay down at night, he could get no rest, but lay awake all night, sunk in sorrowful thoughts. One morning he rose up before dawn, and went outside, for he thought his heart would be lighter in the open air. As he wandered up and down on the banks of the mill pond, he heard a rustling in the water, and when he looked near, he saw a white woman rising up from the waves. He realized at once that this could be none other than the Nixie of the mill pond, and in his terror, he didn't know if he should fly away or remain where he was. While he hesitated, the Nixie spoke, called him by his name, and asked him why he was so sad. When the miller heard how friendly her tone was, he plucked up heart, and told her how rich and prosperous he had been all his life up till now, when he didn't know what he was to do for want and misery. Then the Nixie spoke comforting words to him, and promised that she would make him richer and more prosperous than he had ever been in his life before, if he would give her in return the youngest thing in his house. The miller thought she must mean one of his puppies or kittens, so promised the Nixie at once what she asked, and returned to his mill full of hope. On the threshold, he was greeted by a servant with the news that his wife had just given birth to a boy. The poor miller was much horrified by these tidings, and went in to his wife with a heavy heart to tell her and his relations of the fatal bargain he had just struck with the Nixie. I would gladly give up all the good fortune she promised me, he said, if I could only save my child, but no one could think of any advice to give him beyond taking care that the child never went near the mill pond. So the boy throve and grew big, and in the meantime all prospered with the miller, and in a few years he was richer than he had ever been before. But all the same he did not enjoy his good fortune, for he could not forget his compact with the Nixie, and he knew that sooner or later she would demand his fulfillment of it. But year after year went by, and the boy grew up and became a great hunter, and the lord of the land took him into his service, for he was as smart and bold a hunter as you would wish to see. In a short time he married a pretty young wife, and lived with her in great peace and happiness. One day when he was out hunting, a hare sprang up at his feet, and ran for some way in front of him in the open field. The hunter pursued it hotly for some time, and at last shot it dead. Then he proceeded to skin it, never noticing that he was close to the mill pond, which from childhood up he had been taught to avoid. He soon finished the skinning, and went to the water to wash the blood off his hands. He had hardly dipped them in the pond when the nixie rose up in the water, and seizing him in her wet arms, she dragged him down with her under the waves. When the hunter did not come home in the evening, his wife grew very anxious, and when his game bag was found close to the millpond, she guessed at once what had befallen him. She was nearly beside herself with grief and roamed round and round the pond, calling on her husband, without ceasing, at last worn out with sorrow and fatigue. She fell asleep, and dreamt that she was wandering along a flowery meadow when she came to a hut, where she found an old witch who promised to restore her husband to her. When she awoke next morning, she determined to set out and find the witch, so she wandered on for many a day, and at last she reached the flowery meadow, and found the hut where the old witch lived. The poor wife told her all that had happened, and how she had been told in a dream of the witch's power to help her. The witch counseled her to go to the pond the first time there was a full moon, and to comb her black hair with a golden comb, and then to place the comb on the bank. The hunter's wife gave the witch a handsome present, thanked her heartily, and returned home. Time dragged heavily till the time of the full moon, but it passed at last, and as soon as it rose, the young wife went to the pond, combed her black hair with a golden comb, and when she had finished, placed the comb on the bank. Then she watched the water impatiently. Soon, she heard a rushing sound, and a big wave rose suddenly and swept the comb off the bank, and a minute after the head of her husband rose from the pond and gazed sadly at her, but immediately another wave came, and the head sank back into the water. Without having said a word, the pond lay still and motionless, glittering in the moonshine, and the hunter's wife was not a bit better off than she had been before. In despair she wandered about for days and nights, and at last, worn out by fatigue, she sank once more into a deep sleep, and dreamt exactly the same dream about the old witch. So next morning, she went again to the flowery meadow, and sought the witch in her hut, and told her of her grief. The old woman counseled her to go to the millpond the next full moon, and play upon a golden flute, and then to lay the flute on the bank. As soon as the next moon was full, the hunter's wife went to the millpond, played on a golden flute, and when she had finished, placed it on the bank. Then a rushing sound was heard, and a wave swept the flute off the bank, and soon the head of the hunter appeared and rose up higher and higher, till he was half out of the water. Then he gazed sadly at his wife, and stretched out his arms towards her, but another rushing wave arose, and dragged him under once more. The hunter's wife, who had stood on the bank, full of joy and hope, sank into despair, when she saw her husband snatched away again before her eyes. But for her comfort, she dreamt the same dream a third time, and betook herself once more to the old witch's hut in the flowery meadow. This time, the old woman told her to go the next full moon to the millpond, and to spin there with a golden spinning wheel, and then to leave the spinning wheel on the bank. The hunter's wife did as she was advised, and the first night the moon was full she sat and spun with a golden spinning wheel, and then left the wheel on the bank. In a few minutes, a rushing sound was heard in the waters, and a wave swept the spinning wheel from the bank. Immediately, the head of the hunter rose up from the pond, getting higher and higher each moment, till at length he stepped onto the bank and fell on his wife's neck. But the waters of the pond rose up, suddenly overflowed the bank, where the couple stood, and dragged them under the flood. In her despair, the young wife called on the old witch to help her, and in a moment the hunter was turned into a frog, and his wife into a toad. But they were not able to remain together, for the water tore them apart, and when the flood was over they both resumed their own shapes again. But the hunter and the hunter's wife found themselves each in a strange country, and neither knew what had become of the other. The hunter determined to become a shepherd, and his wife too became a shepherdess, so they herded their sheep for many years in solitude and sadness. Now it happened once that the shepherd came to the country where the shepherdess lived. The neighborhood pleased him, and he saw that the pasture was rich and suitable for his flocks. So he brought his sheep there, and herded them as before. The shepherd and shepherdess became great friends, but they did not recognize each other in the least. But one evening when the moon was full they sat together watching their flocks, and the shepherd played upon his flute. Then the shepherdess thought of that evening when she had sat at the full moon by the millpond, and had played on the golden flute. The recollection was too much for her, and she burst into tears. The shepherd asked her why she was crying, and left her no peace, till she told him all her story. Then the scales fell from the shepherd's eyes, and he recognized his wife, and she him. So they returned joyfully to their own home, and lived in peace and happiness ever after.